and welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I posted a video. I'm excited. I'm going to make some prairie bonnets for some little girls that I know out of this pattern that I bought at the Joann fabric store. So right here, I'm just separating the bonnet pieces of the pattern from the apron and the dress pieces. And right here, it just shows me the pieces that I need for the bonnet. And I stack them all neatly right over there. Getting ready to cut out the pattern pieces out of the fabric. And if you've never used a pattern before, it will show you the best way to arrange the pieces to get the most out of your fabric. But I usually just arrange it myself. You need to read the instructions first, and you need to be aware that some of the pattern pieces will need to go on the fold of the fabric, such as this largest piece, which is the base or the full hat part of the bonnet. I've got the fans going, so I apologize, but it is summer in Phoenix, and so I think on this day it reached 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm just going to lay the pattern pieces out and pin them down and then cut them out. I laid the bonnet piece for the bonnet on the fold of the fabric. Next comes the long piece that's for the ties, and that has to be going on the straight of grain of the fabric. And since the fabric is folded, that will give me two pieces after I've cut it out. So I've laid out all of the pattern pieces, pinned them, and cut them out for view C of the bonnet. I was making 3 bonnets out of 3 different fabrics when I was doing this, and as I went to do the voiceovers, I realized that I had filmed cutting out one fabric and then sewing on a different fabric. So starting at the very beginning to sew on this, I've got the big piece and then the interfacing piece, and it says to sew a reinforcement stitching where I'm pointing with my fingers and where the arrows are on the pattern. I'll stitch 5/8 of an inch in on this to give this some reinforcement. So this is the interfacing piece, and then the other piece is the big part of the bonnet. And I'm pointing out where the reinforcing stitching goes on the big piece of the bonnet. These are the ties. The piece that makes the bow. The piece that makes the knot for the bow. The 5/8 line on this sewing machine is not very clear for me. I always have a trouble with it, figuring out where it is, so I just took my ruler right there just to verify which one it was. And so here I am going ahead and doing that reinforcing stitch. And also on the other side. And then on the interfacing part that will be sewn to the main part of the bonnet. I pinned the right side of the interfacing to the right side of the bonnet, and so now I am sewing those two pieces together starting from the curved spot there, doing a 5/8 of an inch seam. Put the needle down at the corner and then raise the presser foot and pivot the material to go a different way, and then continue on. And stop at that little V or that turn in the fabric. Cut the corners, and then I trimmed everything really closely to the stitching, like about 1/4 of an inch to the stitching, and then I turned it right side out. If I had it to do over again, I don't think that I would have trimmed it up the sides as far as I did. It was a little unclear of how to do it on the instructions, or I just haven't sewn any garments for a while. But so anyway, I turned it right side out, and that's what it looks like. And then just smoothed it out nice. This long piece is for the tie at the chin. There's 2 of them, and so I fold that right sides together, and then starting at the short end, sew the end of the tie and pivot the material when I get to the corner, and then sew the rest of the side of the tie and leave the other end open. Then I did the exact same thing on the other tie. Once I was finished sewing the ties, I cut the corners and then turned them right side out and then ironed them. If you need help getting the corners to be sharp, you can always use blunt scissors or a chopstick, or the blunt end of a bamboo skewer. Now I've folded the part that I'm using to make the bow in half, right sides together, and I am going to sew all the way around that, although I am going to leave an opening at the top of the seams. The pattern said to use a 3/8 of an inch seam on this. So you can see I tacked the stitching down there, and then I moved the needle a couple of inches and then tacked it down and sewed the rest of the way around. If you wanted to do it differently and sew all the way around and just leave one of the ends open, I think you could do that as well. Clip the corners and then turn right side out. And voila. So the little piece for the knot on the bow needs to be folded in half vertically, and then with right sides facing, and then a seam made on one end, and then pull that through so that it's right side out. I bought some 1/2-inch elastic, and that needs to be cut according to the little pattern that was put in the pattern. And so I'm cutting the pieces that I need for that. So just one piece per bonnet. When I was cutting out fabric, I forgot that I needed to have some interfacing. And so I'm cutting that out now. It's needed for the brim on the bonnet. And so I cut out one piece on a fold, and I cut it out of interfacing, or we used to call it pellon in the olden days. I don't know if we still call it that or not, but this is interfacing that is fusible on one side. So I just showed you the shiny side there, and that's the side with the glue on it. So I'm just trimming this up to fit a little better, and then I'm going to iron it on. You need to be careful when you're ironing this on that it doesn't hang over your fabric, or otherwise it will fuse to your ironing board. And we've all done it, so there's no shame in that, but I just want to save you some cleanup and a potential mess. So I ironed that interfacing on to one of the two pieces for the brim, and you just hold the hot iron on for 10 seconds in each place, and then it just fuses onto it. So I'm just ironing the other piece here, and that will also go with that will sew on later. This was very stiff interfacing or pellon that I used. I had gotten it to make a tote bag out of, and so but I didn't get any when I was picking up the supplies for the bonnet, so I just used what I had, and I think it'll be fine. It will certainly hold up. It's a lot like the brim of a baseball cap. I'm just ironing the bonnet part of the bonnet right now, and where that interfacing, where we sewed that interfacing on, so that it all lays flat. And then I'm also turning under the edge about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, so that I can sew that down to make a little opening for the elastic that we cut. And I'm ironing that down so that that will be easier to sew on. If you're going to push through a corner with a pair of scissors, just be sure that the end of the scissors are blunt. Otherwise, it won't turn out well. I'm also ironing this piece that we have for the bow. When I was at the ironing board, I put a few creases into the ties, and now I'm just going to sew them just to keep the creases together. Now I have the main piece of the bonnet where I folded over or folded under 1/8 of an inch on the interfacing part. So I am just going to stitch that down very close to the edge. And then once I do that, then I am going to stitch over about 5/8 of an inch so we have a casing for our elastic. I'm just eyeballing this. You can mark it with the ruler with a chalk pencil if you need help that way, or mark out the measurement with pins. But the stitching will be gathered, so it won't show whether the stitching is straight or not. And remember how I measured those 3 pieces of elastic earlier? Well, I don't know what I did with them because I can't find them. So I figured I must have thrown them out with scraps of fabric. So here I am measuring another piece for the bonnet. I'm putting a pin in one end of the elastic, a safety pin, so that I can pull it through that casing. And here's the part of the video where you may be thinking that I should name my channel Dumb and Dumber. And I leave these parts in my videos so that some people can see that not all of us are perfect. I know most seamstresses don't have these issues, but some do, and that's okay. The only truly mean comment I ever got on one of my videos was stating how incompetent I was and how my standards were low as far as sewing. But I don't believe that just because you want to sew, you have to be perfect at it from the very beginning. It's a skill that you learn and become better at. So yeah, I pulled the elastic straight through on this. So on to try number 2, which was also a fail. And this time I even stitched down the end, but it didn't catch somehow, and I ended up pulling it through again. So I unstitched the end and pulled it through and held on to it and stitched it down, and the third time it worked. So hold on to that sucker tight so that it doesn't slip into the casing and you have to start all over again. And voila, it worked. Back to working on the brim of the bonnet, and I went ahead and I put both pieces right sides together. Remember, we've got interfacing on one piece so it's stiff, but right sides together, and then I'm going to pin it in place. Once it's pinned in place, I start about 5/8 of an inch in and start sewing with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the curvy side of the brim of the hat. Then once it's tacked down at the end and 5/8 of an inch is left at the end, then I go ahead and just trim close to the seam and then turn it right side out. And you'll need to do all kinds of messing and fussing with it to get the fold to be directly on the seam, or the seam directly on the fold. I ironed the brim down so that it was nice and flat and easier to work with. And it looks really cute. On the lid of my sewing machine, it has a guide and it tells you exactly what you need to set everything at for different stitches. So right now I'm setting the machine up to do a basting stitch. And I wanted to just try it out first on a scrap piece of fabric to make sure it was what I was expecting or what I wanted. And it was. So now I am just going to do that basting stitch around the large part of the bonnet, the round part of the bonnet. And so I'm going to go make 2 different rows. Right now I'm doing it a 1/2 inch seam allowance, or a 1/2 inch, and then I will do 5/8 of an inch. Now comes the fun part where I find the ends of those threads and then start doing the gathering on the bonnet. And so I start with one side first, and then I go to the other side and just make the gathers even. And I'm just amazed at how this is starting to look like a bonnet. So cute. I'm not going to show it, but on one of the other bonnet brims, I basted the 2 pieces together, but I actually found out that I think it works better if they're not basted. I line up the notches of the brim of the hat to the gathered part of the bonnet, and then adjust the gathered part to fit the brim. place the ties where they're supposed to go and then pin them into place. But after looking at it, I realize that that's not right, because the part of the brim that isn't sewed down needs to come over and go over the ragged parts, or the unsewn parts, and it won't be able to do that with the tie there. So I need to look at the instructions and figure it out again. So now I'm placing the tie on the wrong side of the big part of the hat. Then the right side of the brim will go on the right side of the large part of the hat. That will allow me to fold under the raw edges, and then one side of the brim will be able to fold over, and then I'll be able to hand stitch that over it so there's no raw edges showing. So right now I'm just tacking down the ties so that I'll be able to sew them without them moving or shifting about. I need to make sure that the tie is completely straight so that it doesn't get caught up into any of the stitching. And then I put the one layer of the brim I'm pinning down, and now I am going to sew the brim to the large part of the hat with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's a little tricky as you try to keep the one piece of fabric of the brim pulled back so that you don't catch that in the stitching, and you try to keep the gathers straight and have them not fold wonky. And so, but it turned out really nice, I think. Just remember to take challenges like this slow, and it will work out fine. I sped the video speed up, so I'm not actually sewing fast here, but it's a boring part of the video, so I sped it up. Remembering that the ties go inward towards the middle. And then I just finished it off at the end, even with the ruffle, and tacked it down. And so you can see now how I need to put those raw edges underneath and fold the bottom part of the brim over and then under so that I can hand sew it. And so you can see on some of the sides, especially this one, it was a little tricky to put the material or the fabric over the raw edges and tuck them in. I would have liked for this to have looked better than it did when it was finished, but I'm just chalking it up to experience. And I hope to perfect my bonnet making skills sometime in the future. But all in all, they really didn't look too bad once I clipped off all the stray threads and pulled out all the basting stitches. Now I just need to sew up that open part in that bow piece. Once that's closed, I just kind of gather up the bow piece and then put that little piece for the knot around it. And then I just hand stitch that quickly to secure it. It was late at night when I was doing this, so the lighting is really bad. But I folded the bonnet in half to find the middle in the back, and then I just tacked down the bow in the middle on that elastic piece. I also just hand stitched the top and the bottom of the knot of the bow onto the bonnet just so it would stay more secure. You can make the bonnets without the bows, but I think the bow is just really cute on this. Now I'm just tucking those raw edges underneath the bottom part of the brim and bringing that over and folding a piece under and then pinning it. And then I hand sewed or hand stitched that down and into place. After I pinned everything down, then I hand stitched it in place. It took about an hour to do so. So there you have the finished little girl's prairie bonnet. I made this pattern in 3 separate fabrics. It would be a great sun hat for the beach, or working in the garden, or playing outside, for dress up or historical presentations or plays. This pattern seemed to run a little large for size, as I had my adult daughter model one of the bonnets on this video. So thank you for joining me. This was a lot of fun. Have a good day and goodbye.